Hello, everyone. Today we're going to get started with our first lecture. This is Age of Enterprise, Capital, and Labor. So if you'd like to follow along, just download that PowerPoint. Okay, so just a little timeline for you. The Civil War took place from 1861 to 1865. After the Civil War, you had Civil War Reconstruction, which was bringing the southern states back into the country. And then after that, after 1877, we have this era of great industrialization. It's the time of captains of industry and robber barons, labor disputes. You have steel, railroads, skyscrapers, lots of industrialization and urbanization. This period roughly lasts from the 1870s to the 1890s, and it does spill over into the 1900s. None of these eras are clean. They don't start and end on a certain date. They kind of bleed into the next. But this period from the 1870s to the 1890s, it's called the Age of Enterprise. Sometimes it's called the Gilded Age. It's also called the Age of Steel. So they're kind of different ways of looking at it. An enterprise is just a project of undertaking, typically one that is difficult and requires effort, particularly a bold or arduous or hazardous undertaking, either physical or moral. And I got a picture of some steel workers sitting on a I-beam of a skyscraper way up high eating their lunch. And to me, that takes a lot of enterprise to accomplish something like that. And I kind of want to tell the story of a few people, but I want to start off with two young boys from Scotland, Andrew and Tom. Now, their father, William, is a weaver. That means he takes different pieces of cloth and he weaves them together to make fabric. So he works as a weaver from his own home in Scotland. His machines are in his house or his shop. But the Industrial Revolution comes to Britain, to the United Kingdom, and there's this new invention called the power loom, and it replaces the skilled workers like William that weave their cloth. So William, the father, is driven out of work. His wife Margaret has to take care of Andrew and his younger brother Tom. She opens a small shop in front of her home. She sells groceries. She has a shoe repair shop in the back of her house, or kind of in the back of her room. And that's what happens a lot of times is the father will get out of work, so the mother and sometimes the children have to kind of make things work for the family. If you look at slide 8, you can see their house. Now, this young boy Andy, he really took it to heart how hard it was on his father. He said, "I began to learn what poverty meant. Dreadful days came when father took the last of his webs to the great manufacturers, his machines, and I saw my mother anxiously waiting his return. It was burnt into my heart then that my father had to beg for work, and there came the resolve that I would cure that when I got to be a man." So this young boy Andy wants to never be in his father's shoes. There's a disastrous winter in 1848, so the family decides to move to Pittsburgh. The mother has relatives there. They auction off their home. They sell their remaining machines, their father's machines. They even have to borrow a little bit of money to come to America. So you've got this young boy who comes to America um, early on in his life in the 1840s. Fast forward to about 1900, that young boy Andy, who used to live in this tiny little house, he now goes back to Scotland and buys Skibo Castle, which is a 40,000 acre estate, huge castle, hundreds of rooms. This young man, Andy, is Andrew Carnegie, probably the most famous industrialist of this era. Um, he was born in 1835 and he dies in 1919, just after World War I. So we're going to get to know a little bit about him. And if you would like, I've provided a link on slide 13. You can always watch this documentary. I'll try to provide links to documentaries in case you find a particular person interesting and want to learn more about them. I'll also provide books in case you'd like to read something. Some of these people you'll find interesting, some of them not so much. So there you go. So one of the things I want you to keep in mind while we study the industrial era is, are these men we study, are they captains of industry or are they robber barons? Captains of industry means they are hardworking men who use their wit, their intellect, their resolve to build empires that benefit the United States. They give jobs to people. They provide transportation and infrastructure for the nations. A captain of industry is a positive view of these men. Or are they robber barons? Robber barons means that they get rich by paying their workers as little as possible. They cut corners when they have to. They cheat other industrialists and they cheat the people that work for them. It's generally a negative view of these industrials. So keep in mind, some of these people you might say he was the captain of industry, but this other guy was a robber baron. Just kind of keep that in mind. There's a lot of factors in industrialization. You've got railroads, you've got capitalists, people like Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Morgan. You've got tons of new inventions. The industrial age, the age of enterprise, just has an explosion of patents awarded for new inventions. You have resources throughout the United States. You have new methods of organizing businesses like the corporation, and more specifically, the large corporation. You have a growing workforce. The American population is increasing during this era, uh, partly due to Americans having children of their own, but also lots of immigration. Okay, so you can kind of go through each of those and see how each of those factors contributed to industrialization. I've kind of got some maps going on, so you can kind of see where some of the resources are, where some of the railroad networks are. But I want to talk a little bit about steel because steel does drive this era of industrialization. That's why it's also called the Age of Steel. Now, factories have been around for a long time. You've got textile, shoe, furniture, paper factories in the United States. But a lot of the times, these products can be made at home by artisans in small shops. It's not really a large-scale enterprise. But the nation is industrializing, and you need railroads, trains, machinery, commercial buildings. So you need something bigger, a bigger factory system. Now, before this age of steel, you have the iron industry produce something called wrought iron. It's a malleable metal. It's used by blacksmiths and farmers. It's not very durable. And I've got a YouTube clip on slide 23 if you would like to watch and learn more about kind of the science and the, I guess, technical aspects of these things. You can click on that, but it's not necessarily vital for the understanding of its importance regarding history. Wrought iron is not good for industrial use because it's too malleable. You can't use it for railroad tracks because it'll get squished by the weight of the trains. A blacksmith or a farmer, they can take their hammer out there and kind of beat the wrought iron in the shape they need it. They don't have huge, heavy machines that put too much stress on this wrought iron. Wrought iron is also very expensive. Um, People who make wrought iron are called puddlers. Puddling is a skilled job. You basically have to remove the impurities to make wrought iron, and I kind of liken it to cooking. Basically, you have a recipe, but you also have to watch it as you cook. You taste it, the food, and if it needs a little extra salt or spice, you put that in. Obviously, you don't taste the wrought iron; that would burn your tongue. But while you're making wrought iron, a puddler will literally look into the iron being melted, and he'll see what color it is. He'll stir it around. Sometimes they spit in it to see what color the flame is, and if the flame's the right color, they know it's done. So it's a very skilled job to be a puddler. But then a new process comes along called the Bessemer process. The British inventor Henry Bessemer, he designs a new type of furnace in the 1850s. It's called the Bessemer converter. On slide 26, I've got a bunch of pictures of it so you can kind of see what it looks like. It's a pear-shaped furnace. It's made of steel and fire clay bricks. Basically, air holes at the bottom of the furnace blast air into the converters. It oxidizes the impurities, and those impurities either escape in gas or they form this slag that you can get rid of later. If you'd like to watch some videos kind of learning the science behind this, you're welcome to. When the process is completed, the steel is poured into molds of the desired shape. So you pour it into railroad ties or a track, or you pour it into beams for skyscrapers. This steel is very durable. So it's great for the big scale building that has to go on. And this Bessemer converter does not require puddlers anymore. You don't have to be a skilled worker to work this thing. You just have to learn how it works. You put the steel in or the iron in for a certain amount of time. You heat it to a certain temperature. You pour it out after a certain amount of time. It's very specific. the way you do it, so you don't have to have a skilled worker kind of stirring it and looking and judging when it's done on their own. And Andrew Carnegie is going to harness this Bessemer converter and use it in America. Now, early on, he takes a number of different jobs. He stoked boilers in a textile factory for 12 hours a day. He was a messenger boy for a telegraph office. He would deliver messages all over Pittsburgh to the leading men of the city, and he would always memorize them and introduce himself so that he would basically someday be one of them. He learns everything he can. He thought the best way to get ahead was to use his mind. He eventually takes a job with the Pennsylvania Railroad, and he works for Tom Scott. There's a couple stories. One story is some trains go off the track. Tom Scott is not in the office, and Andrew is in the office, and some people don't know what to do. So Andrew Carnegie basically says, "I'll go ask," and he goes into the office and he basically writes down what should be done, and he goes out and tells them this is what the boss says. Basically, he said, "Throw all the crashed trains off the track, burn them by the side. Time is money. We got to get the next train through." And later on, when Tom Scott hears about this, he doesn't say anything to Andrew, to young Andrew. Andrew thinks he's upset, but it turns out Tom Scott was very proud. He would always say, "You should hear what my boy Andy did." And there's also a story about Andrew Carnegie setting up a telegraph wire during the first major battle of the Civil War, First Bull Run or First Manassas. Basically, there was some tension, and the telegraph wire came up and hit him in the face. And this was right before this first battle, so Andrew used to joke that he was the first casualty of the Civil War. Later on, he starts the J. Edgar Thompson Works. It's a steel plant outside Pittsburgh. It makes steel cheaper, fuels the growth of the nation. The price of steel drops from $28 a ton to $18 a ton. Cheaper steel means more railroads, skyscrapers, bridges, more growth for the nation. This is an argument for Andrew Carnegie as being a captain of industry. He makes building materials cheaper, so that means more people are willing to build, so that fuels the growth of the nation. By 1900, Carnegie Steel produces more steel than the entire nation of Great Britain. Later on, he sells it for $480 million. Carnegie spent a lot of his life doing philanthropy. He built libraries all over the United States. He said, "I'll build the library if you can staff it." At the Edgar Thompson Works, he had libraries, reading rooms, community centers, music halls, athletic facilities. The idea is that his workers will be able to take part in these things. But he believes he can benefit the working man more by building up institutions that benefit him than by just giving money to the individual. Carnegie is not a big fan of handouts. He doesn't want to see a beggar on the side and give him a handout. He'd rather build a library so that person can go read and better themselves. He gave away $350 million while he was alive, and after he died, the trust that he set up gave away more money. It's still giving away money. So his contributions to the country, his philanthropy, his bridges, railroads, skyscrapers, cheaper building materials. Railroads are another thing that grow really big during this era. Locomotives arrived from Britain in the 1830s. They're used in the Civil War. They're financed by private investors, but the government does provide incentives. The government buys railroad bonds. The government provides land grants. And if you look at slide 32, you can kind of see how railroads grew throughout the history of this kind of age of enterprise. There's lots of improvements in railroad building. You have steel rails. You have iron and steel bridges, more powerful locomotives and the such. The Transcontinental Railroad is completed in 1869. And you can kind of see some of these bridges and passes that have to be built. They're pretty big feats of engineering. If you look at slide 38, there's a map of the Transcontinental Railroad. There's a great documentary there if you'd like to watch that. It's excellent. A lot of interesting stuff going into building the Transcontinental Railroad. There's tons of different railroads throughout the country. Excuse me. Some of the more famous railroad builders are Cornelius Vanderbilt. He first started out in the steamboat business. He was born at the end of the 1700s, but then later gets into railroads. He basically consolidates previously built railroads. Um, I got a little YouTube clip on him if you'd like to watch. The most famous railroad builder is James J. Hill. He was actually a Canadian, but then he comes to America. He goes to work on the St. Paul and Pacific Railway. He learns the ins and outs of the business. He basically buys the bankrupt company and then builds it up. He wants to build a railroad through the Red River Valley to the Pacific Ocean, so kind of from Minnesota over to the Pacific Ocean. He refuses to accept any government money, so he doesn't like the government involved in capitalism or private industry. He just wants the government to kind of be a judge, be a provide order and stability, and then let the captains of industry do their magic. Um, his railroad endeavor gets known as Hill's Folly. People make fun of him, they mock him, they say, "You'll never do it. All the other tycoons take money from the government. You have to do it as well. How can you compete with people that have the government on their side?" But he succeeds. He renames this railroad the Great Northern Railway Company. Um, he would send people over to Europe to advertise, "Come to my area, come along my railroad, I'll ship you somewhere and you'll get some land," because these railroads will die unless you have people settle them. There's another documentary if you'd like to learn some more about James J. Hill, but he's the most famous railroad builder and he famously accepted no money from the government. Jay Gould is another railroad executive. He's more of a speculator. His weak railroads often force down the rates of competitors. So sometimes historians say, well, he wasn't a really good railroad tycoon, but he helped people by having such a terrible railroad that it forced people to compete with him. So I don't know if I buy that, but that's kind of one of the arguments. Another interesting person, not a railroad tycoon, but an inventor, George Westinghouse. He invents air brakes. It was very dangerous. People had to stand on top of the trains and manually turn on a brake. And think about it, if you're standing on top of a train, you can fall over. If the train derails, you're probably going to die. So George Westinghouse developed a way to shut the train off using air. This YouTube clip on slide 44 is just a real short clip, so it's pretty interesting. I think you should watch it. And the railroads influence the nation. They create a national marketplace, so you get beef from the Great Plains that go to Chicago and then go back east. You get raw materials shipped all over the country. Iron ore from Lake Superior goes to the coal sites of Pennsylvania to make steel. Magazine and newspapers go national. If you run a newspaper in New York, you can get that newspaper to San Francisco, so people on the West Coast can know what's going on the East Coast. Life speeds up under the railroad system. You have the establishment of zones. There used to be so many time zones. Uh, Railroad stations would have just a wall of clocks for all the different times they had to keep track of. So the railroad industry gets together and says, we got to change this. And overall, freight costs fall. The amount it costs to transport freight drops about 50% from the 1870s to the 1890s. So you have just large scale enterprise. Before the Civil War, manufacturing is done on a small basis. Markets are nearby. After the Civil War, you have large factories, and you now have a national market that leads to large scale enterprise. The economist David A. Wells, he said, combinations of capital on a scale hitherto wholly unprecedented constitute one of the remarkable features of modern business methods. So you have the American market and market control. American, geographically speaking, allows goods to flow across the nation. The immigrant population increases. That means more workers. Railroads link local markets to a national market, and capitalists have money to corner the market. That's kind of the idea of the American market. Another pretty famous inventor or tycoon, I guess you could say, is Gustavus Swift. He's a Chicago cattle dealer who was originally from Massachusetts. Chicago is the cattle market for the country. Beef is shipped from the Great Plains to Chicago and then back east. Typically, when you ship livestock back east, it loses weight while it's being shipped because it's not grazing. So what Gustavus Swift does is he develops a cooling system, and a fleet of refrigerated cars. So now he slaughters the cattle in Chicago and ships them back east. He sets up a network of branch houses and delivery wagons. He also has a whole network of things you need to basically do this. He's got a fertilizer organization, chemicals, other byproducts. Um, Eventually, he has stockyards in Chicago, Kansas City, Texas, Nebraska. He manages everything from the production of this to the selling of the product. This is called vertical integration. If you look at slide 49, you can see how he controls everything from the original product all the way to the finished product. And supposedly he used so much of the animal that he said the only thing that was wasted was the pig's squeal. Um, Another probably the second most famous industrialist of this era is Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller. He's another rich captain of industry or robber baron, depending on how you view him. Slide 50, I've got a picture of his house. Somebody said that God would have built this house if he had had the money. So the saying goes is Rockefeller is richer than God. But there's a great documentary on him. He's a really interesting person. His parents, there's a really funny story. William and Eliza Rockefeller. His father was a swindler. He basically goes door to door ripping people off. He goes to Eliza's door, pretends to be deaf. He has like a sticker on his shirt that says, "I'm deaf, I'm mute, I need help." And she was a very religious, very devout Christian person. And it's kind of weird. They fall in love, even though you got the pious Christian woman and the swindler kind of cheapskate husband. So Rockefeller learns his morality from his mother, but he learns business lessons from his father, tough business lessons. Um, his father used to say that he did business deals with his sons, and he would try to cheat them, so he would make them sharp. So they don't get any break from the hard lessons of life when they're dealing with their father. Rockefeller eventually drops out of high school. He becomes an assistant bookkeeper. He keeps track of everything he buys or sells. He eventually becomes a Cleveland grain dealer, later gets in on the oil business. Oil gets discovered. Drilling for oil is risky. You don't always know where to find it. If you drill, you might not strike oil. So Rockefeller goes into something a little more safe, refining oil. Some people do take risks and find oil. So if they find the oil, they bring it to you and you refine it. By age 25, Rockefeller has one of the largest oil refineries in the world. So on slide 54, if you want, you can watch a little bit of documentaries on how oil became about, but not necessary for us. Rockefeller eventually falls in love with a girl named Laura Spelman. They're very romantic. They would read their ledger books together. So what they do for romance is in the evening they get out their books that calculated how much they spent and saved and earned, and they would go over that together. They get married. They have 4 children. They're very worried that the wealth will corrupt their children. Sometimes you get rich parents that give their kids everything. The Rockefellers were rich parents that gave their kids nothing because they didn't want them to grow up spoiled. The children wore hand-me-down clothing. They shared toys. They had to earn an allowance and they had to do chores. Laura once said, "I'm so glad my son has told me what he wants for Christmas, so now it can be denied him." So this is a parent who kind of looks with a little bit of joy to crushing their children's hopes and dreams a little bit, because that's how life is, right? If you give your kid everything you want, you're not preparing them for life. So I always joke that Christmas at the Rockefellers is like Ralphie's Christmas, where he gets the bunny suit instead of the Red Ryder BB gun. I think that's basically how the Rockefeller children must have felt. Rockefeller starts Standard Oil. This is his main oil business. He does start this scheme called the South Improvement Company to take over the whole industry. It's basically a conspiracy or a monopoly among the railroad and some of the oil refiners to take over the market. And basically, this works over time. Rockefeller corners the whole refining business. He eventually controls 90% of the oil refineries in the world. And he said the day of combination is here to stay. individualism has gone, never to return. So sometimes these robber barons or captains of industry are criticized because they're laissez-faire, individualist. Leave the individual to themselves. The government should stay out of everything. That's not always the case. Some of these tycoons are very much, um, uh, I'm trying to think of the word, collectivists. They believe that we're all kind of in this together. The individual's not there. Um, but anyways, he gets criticized a lot in the press. Got some political cartoons on slide 60. And basically, what ends up happening is Rockefeller's pastor says, "You're getting really rich. You got too much money. You need to find a way to give it away." So Rockefeller decides he's also going to devote his life to giving his wealth away. There's a saying that half the country wanted to lynch Rockefeller because he was so rich, and the other half wanted a loan from him. He gets tens of thousands of letters a month asking for money, but he does retire and devotes his life to giving his money away. So philanthropy, he lowers kerosene from 23 cents a gallon to 7 cents. And you might think, like, what's the big deal? That's how people lit their homes, with kerosene lamps. So before John D. Rockefeller, it would be hard to light your home at night. You would have to have candles. They don't give off very good light. But after Rockefeller, people can have light in their homes all night long, and you have time to read in the evening. Just think about the winter when there's not much sunlight. You would go to work all day and you'd come home and be in a dark house. So that's one thing Rockefeller does. He funds medical research. He looks for more productive ways to grow corn. He wants to end starvation and famine. He funds education for black women at Spelman College. He founds the University of Chicago. He gave away $530 million before his death in 1937. He said the great task that he had to undertake was to solve the problem of giving money away without making paupers of those who receive it. So people like Carnegie and Rockefeller are very much worried about, if they give their money away, is that going to make people soft? He sees charity should be a way to fix society, not just ameliorate it. So don't just treat the symptoms, treat the causes of poverty. If you want to read an article on slide 62 about all the charitable work he did, you're welcome to do that. Another kind of famous industrialist is James Pierpont Morgan. He's a finance capitalist. He doesn't build a business like Carnegie or Rockefeller, but he does basically use his influence with the banking system. Now, he's born into wealth, so he's not like some of these other guys. He purchases Carnegie Steel. By the 19 teens, him and his associates have a net worth of something like $22 billion. If you want to watch something on him, you can. All right, so that's kind of a few stories of some industrialists, some of the things they contributed. What about the workers in the factories? Well, life was pretty hard for them. 12-hour days, 6 days a week, sometimes 7. You don't have vacations. You have no unemployment compensation, no sick leave, no accident insurance. You have to eat while you work. Work is very monotonous. The working conditions are not safe. Factory conditions are dirty. There's poor ventilation, poor lighting. You have dangerous equipment. Lots of people are killed on the job. You have child labor. Sometimes children as young as 5 years old work long hours for short money. Immigrants do a lot of the building in America. They follow their relatives. They live in ethnic neighborhoods. Women also work. There's over 4 million workers that are women in 1900. Traditionally, women, wives worked in the home, but this kind of begins to change. Basically, a third of those women workers are domestic servants, a third are teachers and nurses, and then a third work in the textile industry. But if you live in the city, and this is also true of the countryside, you know, going to market, buying the food, taking care of the children, a lot of kids aren't in school during this era. So taking care of the family is a full-time job. The woman, the wife at home, works just as hard as the man in the factory because she's got to take care of the kids. I've got a couple of quotes on slide 69. So you basically, if you need to, just pause the video, read those. You can see how hard life is for workers at the factory. Another kind of criticism workers had is that the trade got so subdivided that you're not considered a worker at all. Think about like a carpenter building a house. Maybe the old-fashioned way is you built the whole house, the foundation, the studs, the roof, the interior finished work. At the end of your job, you can look at the house you built and you can say, I built that. You have a sense of pride. But after industrialization, there's nobody that does the whole thing anymore. You might have one person that pours the foundation. You might have one person that erects the walls. You might have one person that roofs, one person that does the interior work. So at the end of the day, you can't look and say, I built that whole house. You can look at all the houses on the block and you can say, I poured the foundation for each of those. It's not as amazing when you look at it if you don't build it to the end. Um, this guy, Frederick W. Taylor, he's kind of famous for pioneering something called scientific management. Basically, industrialists started to think, let's apply an engineer's approach to our workers. Let's eliminate the brain work. Let's take away the worker's authority, autonomy. You know, if a worker has to sit there and think about a problem and calculate it, that takes time. Let's make it so he just has to push a lever and pull something through and screw a bolt on or something like that. You can kind of read Frederick Taylor's quote from his Principles of Scientific Management on slide 72, kind of see what he was aiming for. Workers did not like this. You eventually have the growth of the labor movement. Industrialization causes workers to organize to form labor unions. You have different approaches. Should we join political parties as workers and try to influence the political system, or should we just work to get collective bargaining? That's what most people do early on is collective bargaining. We'll negotiate with our employer for better wages, safety, and hours. We're not going to try to drag politics into our business. We're just going to try to get better conditions for ourselves in our factory. One of the early labor organization was the Knights of Labor. Basically, they're founded as a secret society in the 1860s. They're kind of like a social club. Terence V. Powderly was their president or their kind of leader. And over time, they support cooperation. They kind of want more worker cooperation with the owners. They want to use education to basically spread their labor message. Over time, producers would become members of the cooperatives and kind of work with the workers. Basically, it'll take time to change people's points of view about how to run a factory. They're not like diving into politics and picking sides in every presidential election and getting everyone worked up politics. They're just trying to get better conditions for themselves. Another type of labor organization is a trade union. Basically, their goal is to meet the everyday needs of workers. So things like pay, hours, work, safety. They help fellow workers who get hurt on the job, so they'll pool some of their money, and when one of them gets hurt, they'll take care of them. They have something called the closed shop. Only the member of a union can be employed. So if you're a steel workers union and you're a closed shop, if you want a job there, you have to join the union. The American Federation of Labor is probably the most famous labor organization. Samuel Gompers is kind of their leader. He had started out as a cigar maker. He was a very intellectual person, very well read. He argued for pure and simple unionism. Pure meaning workers only, simple meaning only those things that benefited workers. So again, wages, hours, working conditions. He focused on collective bargaining, not political activities. Gompers said, no matter how just, unless the cause is backed up with power to enforce it, it is going to be crushed. And that kind of leads us into, I got 4 kind of great labor issues or labor upheavals during this age of enterprise. The Great Strike of 1877, the Haymarket Riot in 1886, the Homestead Strike in 1892, and the Pullman Strike in 1894. Okay, so first the railroad strike. Basically, you have a panic in 1873. There's a 5-year depression. The railroads kind of take a big hit. So what ends up happening is railroad companies cut the pay of their workers. So the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, this is the first one that kind of gets the ball rolling. When the economy is bad, workers are usually the first one to suffer. The workers at the B&O take 3 wage cuts. They get 10% of their wages cut. So they start to protest. They want their bosses' profits to take a cut before their own wages take a cut. So they protest. They block trains. They block mostly freight cars. Soon this spreads to other railroads. Most railroads east of the Mississippi are involved. 50,000 miles of track is shut down. Basically, freight shipping comes to a halt in the United States. And if you look at slide 85, you can see all the places there were major strikes. There's all kinds of violence. Governors call in the National Guard or the state militia. Sometimes the state militia won't fire on the workers, so federal troops are brought in. Riots erupt in Baltimore, Pittsburgh, Chicago, St. Louis, San Francisco. A lot of Americans see it as an insurrection, not just a strike. Maryland Governor John Carroll calls them the militia, and they actually fight battles in the streets of Maryland against the strikers. Dozens are killed. The Pennsylvania Railroad Union Railroad and Union Depot is burned, so railroad property is being vandalized and destroyed. Thomas Alexander Scott, the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, he says, give them a rifle diet for a few days and see how they like that kind of bread. So some of these tycoons want a hard response, shut these strikes down right away. John Garrett, who's the president of the B&O, he asked for federal troops. President Hayes, who's president from 1877 to 1881, he brings in federal troops. They're street-to-street fighting. The strikes last for about 45 days, but eventually they're suppressed. Next, you have the Haymarket Riot in 1886. You have trade unions that demand an 8-hour workday. At the McCormick Harvesting Machine Company, workers go on strike. McCormick brings in strike breakers. There's a battle between workers and police. 4 strikers are killed. So anarchists call for a protest at Haymarket Square. Anarchist is kind of the radical movement of the age. Socialist and communist movements come a little bit later. So in the age of enterprise, anarchy is kind of the big radicalism that America's fighting. But on May 4th, 1886, the police try to break up a crowd. Someone throws a bomb. One of the workers or one of the anarchists, not all workers are anarchists. There's just a minority that are anarchists. An anarchist throws a bomb. Several police are killed. The police start shooting. More people are killed. Now, these anarchists did pass out pamphlets calling for violence. So, they did want violence to take place. Like I said, some policemen are killed. A number of anarchists are arrested. 4 are executed. 1 kills himself, and the rest receive long prison sentences. Some people had sympathy for these anarchists, and maybe after the explosion and the police killings, maybe the government arrested more people than were directly involved, but just had ties to radicalism, not ties to this violence. That might have been true. But after the Haymarket riot, you have something called the Yellow Dog Contract. Basically, employers force workers to sign contracts promising not to join a union. So if you want a job, you have to promise not to join a union. Labor groups never recover, at least not until the later 1900s. Americans typically don't like radicalism, so whenever there's a riot, whether or not Americans have sympathy for the workers, once there's violence, they kind of lose their sympathy. The Homestead Strike involves Andrew Carnegie. It's one of the more famous ones. Andrew Carnegie purchased the Homestead Steel Works. This was a very unique steel factory. Workers ran the steel mill through their union. So workers have a big say in how the union runs. Carnegie wants to break this union. So he hires a guy named Henry Clay Frick, puts him in charge of breaking the union. And the story, the way it unfolds, the workers' contracts expire at the end of June 1892. So Carnegie wants to hire them all back. But when he hires them all back, he's going to say, you cannot be part of a union. So that's what Carnegie plans to do through Henry Clay Frick. Frick builds a wall around the mill. It's called Frick's Fort. If the workers don't come back non-union, he's just going to hire new workers. Because remember, there's tons of immigrants coming into the country. There's always someone else to replace you if you get fired or quit or die on the job. So there's an abundance of workers. So that kind of helps these industrialists kind of have more power. Well, the workers don't plan to leave their union. Um, so what ends up happening is the workers take over the mill, and Frick brings in Pinkerton guards. They're guns for hire. They're private security, depending on your view. So the Pinkerton guards approach from the river. There's a 14-hour gunfight. There's bombs. There's oil fires. Workers light railroad cars or objects and throw them down the river, down the bank to try to hit these Pinkerton detectives. The Homestead strike tarnishes Andrew Carnegie's reputation. He's off on vacation, I think in Scotland, and basically he pretends like he's not available, so he kind of lets his right-hand man take care of this. Um, and so this ruined his reputation with his workers. Someone later tried to assassinate Henry Clay Frick. Henry Clay Frick either got shot or stabbed a number of times, like 3 or 4 times. I can't remember off the top of my head. And he basically finishes his day's work and then goes home and gets some medical attention. Okay, the Pullman strike. You have another panic in the 1890s. Basically, the railroads start to collapse. A lot of them go bankrupt. And you have this guy named George Pullman who invents luxury cars. He would attach a luxury car to a train, and if you want to take a trip, you can pay to ride or stay in this luxury car. He has a factory near Chicago that builds this. This is a company town. A lot of times, these industrialists will build a whole town. It'll have schools, maybe a school. It'll have a church, a post office, a goods store so you can buy food. It'll have houses built by the industrialists, and workers live in this town. So what ends up happening is Pullman has this company town that produces these Pullman cars, but he has to lay off workers because of this panic in the 1890s. So he lays off workers, he cuts other workers' wages, but he doesn't cut the rent that they have to pay, which is kind of a dumb move if you're the boss because, if they're also renting from you, you know how much money they're making, so if you cut their wages, you're kind of cutting your own bottom line as well. So what happens is the Pullman workers go on strike. They're led by a man named Eugene V. Debs. He's very important. He's kind of America's leading socialist. Basically, the workers shut down any train that's carrying a Pullman car. So they don't let anybody carry a Pullman car. Trains that do carry Pullman cars, other workers go on strike. What ends up happening is this interferes with the mail, and this gets the federal government involved. So what ends up happening, basically, in the end, is President Grover Cleveland sends in federal troops. He says you can't interfere with the delivery of the mail. That's a terrible thing that would grind the nation to a halt. Eventually, Eugene Debs goes to jail. He comes out more radical later on. He helps launch the Socialist Party of America in the early 1900s. We'll hear more about him as we get towards World War I. So what do we take away from all these strikes? Labor union drops, membership drops, violence, anarchy, foreign political ideologies like socialism and communism, those turn off a lot of Americans because, anarchy, socialism, communism is kind of the antithesis of America. So that turns off most Americans, even most American workers. Most American workers are not radicals. It also makes people afraid to associate with labor unions. Americans like law and order typically. So there's kind of during this era, there's a growing resentment brewing between labor and capital, between the workers and their bosses. So that's kind of the age of enterprise, talking about capital and labor. Later on, we'll talk about politics, culture, and foreign policy.